The city lights flickered in the distance, but for Isabella, the world had never felt darker. The cold wrapped around her like an iron grip, seeping through her thin coat, making her bones ache from exhaustion. She sat against the rough brick wall of an old building, its surface icy against her back, but she had stopped feeling the cold long ago. The streets of Lisbon had turned cruel over the months, a place that once held memories of laughter and warmth, but now offered nothing but indifference. People walked past without a second glance, their eyes skimming over her as if she didn't exist, as if her children curled up beside her weren't real, as if their hunger wasn't pressing against their tiny ribs like a slow, unrelenting torture. She shifted slightly, trying to create even the smallest warmth between her and her children. Matteo, 10 years old, had his arms wrapped around his younger sister Sofia, whose tiny face was buried in his chest. Isabella reached out and ran her fingers through Sofia's tangled curls, whispering softly, "Everything's okay, sweetheart." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Sofia stirred, her small fingers clutching at Isabella's coat. Her voice, weak and drowsy, barely rose above the city noise. "Mama, I'm hungry." The words sent a sharp, familiar pain through Isabella's chest. She had heard them too many times, always coming from lips too young to understand why the world was so cruel. She shut her eyes for a moment, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew Matteo was listening too, waiting for her answer. She had run out of comforting words, of the little distractions she used to keep them from thinking about the hunger clawing at their stomachs. She forced a smile, her fingers grazing Sofia's cheek. "Close your eyes, Princessa. Tomorrow morning we'll have a big breakfast, pancakes with honey." Sofia, too young to question the lies of survival, let out a soft, hopeful hum. But Matteo, he wasn't fooled. He was old enough now to recognize the way Isabella's voice trembled when she promised things she couldn't give. He looked at her then, his dark eyes filled with something far worse than sadness. Acceptance. He no longer asked when they would have a home again. He no longer cried. He only stared into the night, silent, carrying a weight he shouldn't have to bear. The scent of fresh bread and pastries drifted through the air, curling around them like a cruel invitation. Just across the street, a small bakery remained open late, its golden light spilling onto the pavement, creating a warmth that never reached them. Inside, a family sat by the window, their laughter muffled by the glass. A little boy, no older than Matteo, bit into a warm croissant, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of cocoa. Isabella felt her son's breath hitch beside her. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Stay here," she whispered. She pushed herself to her feet, her body protesting every movement. Hunger made her dizzy, made her legs feel like they belonged to someone else, but she ignored it as she crossed the street, the bakery's warmth hitting her the moment she stepped inside. The woman behind the counter glanced up, offering a polite smile that faltered the second she took in Isabella's appearance. Isabella had seen that look before: pity, discomfort, the silent struggle of someone trying to decide if helping was worth the trouble. "How much for a loaf of bread?" Isabella asked, her voice careful, steady. The woman hesitated before glancing at the basket of pastries nearing the end of the day. She sighed, then slid the basket forward. "These will be thrown out soon," she said softly. "Take them." Shame burned through Isabella's chest, but she forced herself to nod. "Thank you." She gathered the bread and turned toward the door, but before she could step outside, she froze. A man was watching. He stood across the street, his posture relaxed but unwavering. His hood was pulled over his head, but even in the dim lighting, there was something about the way he stood, something almost too familiar. As she stepped outside, their eyes met for a brief moment before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Isabella's heart pounded. When she returned to her children, Matteo immediately noticed the shift in her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice sharp, alert. "Nothing," Isabella said quickly, kneeling beside them and breaking the bread into pieces. "Here, eat." Matteo took his share but didn't drop it. "Who was that man?" "I don't know," she admitted, glancing back toward the alley. "But he was watching us." The thought lingered long after they had finished their small meal. long after Sophia had fallen asleep curled against Isabella's side. The next night, the hunger returned with vengeance. Isabella could feel it tightening in her stomach like a rope, but she barely noticed it anymore. Instead, she found herself looking over her shoulder, searching the streets, wondering if the man from the night before would return. And then, just as the night before, he appeared, the man in the hood. This time, he didn't linger in the shadows. He walked straight toward them, his movements sure, purposeful. Isabella's body tensed, her grip tightening around Sophia instinctively, but something in her gut told her he wasn't a threat. He stopped a few feet away, his face still partially hidden beneath the dim streetlights. "Are you hungry?" His voice was calm, steady. Isabella hesitated. "We'll be fine." The man exhaled, as if he had expected that answer. Without another word, he turned and walked into the bakery. Isabella watched, confused, unsure of what to make of it, until moments later, he returned. With bags full of food, hot meals, fresh bread, cups of cocoa, still steaming. He placed them beside her, his expression unreadable. "Eat." Isabella's throat tightened. "Why are you doing this?" The man didn't answer right away. He simply lowered his hood. And then Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her. She knew that face. The world knew that face. Cristiano Ronaldo. Her breath hitched, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But it was. He stood in front of her, the most famous footballer in the world, holding out food for her children as if he were just another passerby, as if he were no different from the strangers who had ignored them night after night. Matteo was frozen, his hands clenching at his sides. "You're..." he whispered, but the words died before he could say them. Ronaldo knelt, his gaze level with Matteo's. "No child should have to sleep on the streets," he said softly. "No mother should have to wonder if her children will eat tomorrow." Isabella's vision blurred with tears, her breath shaky. "I don't understand," she whispered. Ronaldo smiled, a kindness in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time. "You will." And with that, he extended his hand, not to give, not to pity, but to pull them out of the darkness they had been trapped in for too long. The wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of fresh bread and warm pastries, a cruel reminder of everything Isabella and her children didn't have. They sat in the same spot outside the bakery, their bodies huddled together for warmth, their thin blankets doing little to fight off the bitter chill. It had been another long, hungry day, another battle with exhaustion and hopelessness. Isabella kept her arms wrapped tightly around Sophia, trying to block out the sound of her stomach growling, trying to ignore the way Matteo's face had hardened over the weeks. She didn't know how much longer they could keep going like this. The city around them was alive, but none of it belonged to them. Families walked past, laughing, their bags filled with groceries, their lives untouched by the kind of suffering Isabella now knew all too well. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the shame. It was the way people refused to meet her eyes, the way they averted their gaze as if acknowledging her existence would be an inconvenience. But then she noticed him, the man in the hood. He was standing a few feet away, his posture casual yet unreadable. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, his face partially obscured by the dim glow of the streetlights. She had seen him before, the night at the bakery. He had watched them then too, lingering just long enough to make her wonder, to make her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. But now, he wasn't just watching, he was moving toward them. Isabella tensed, instinctively pulling her children closer. She had learned not to trust easily, had learned that kindness was often followed by conditions, by something people wanted in return. But something about the way he approached, slowly, deliberately, told her that this was different. He crouched down a few feet away from them, resting his elbows on his knees, his hood still shielding most of his face. For a moment he said nothing, simply observing, as if trying to understand them. Then, in a voice smooth and calm, he spoke. "Are you hungry?" Isabella stiffened. She had heard that question before, always from well-meaning strangers who would toss a few coins at her feet and walk away, feeling satisfied with their small act of charity. But this man wasn't holding out money. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her as if he genuinely wanted to know the answer. "We're fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. The man let out a breath, shaking his head slightly, as if he had expected that response. He turned his gaze to Matteo, who stared back at him unflinching. "What's your name?" the man asked. Matteo hesitated, glancing at Isabella as if waiting for permission. She gave a small nod. "Matteo," the man nodded thoughtfully. "That's a strong name. You look after your sister, don't you?" Matteo's jaw clenched slightly, but he nodded. "Yeah." The man's eyes softened. "That's good." There was something about him, something familiar, but Isabella couldn't place it. His presence was strange, out of place. Why was he here, talking to them, sitting on the ground like he belonged in their world? She cleared her throat. "Why are you here?" she asked carefully. The man studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Because I can be." It wasn't an answer, not really, but there was something in his tone, something that made her believe he meant it. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked away. Isabella blinked in surprise. That was it? He had come here just to ask if they were hungry, to talk for a few minutes, and then leave? She exhaled, shaking her head. Maybe she had imagined something more. Maybe she had wanted to believe in something more. But people like them didn't get miracles. And then he came back, not empty-handed. He was carrying bags, warm food, fresh bread, clothes, blankets. Isabella's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she stared at the bags in disbelief. No one had ever done something like this for them. He knelt down again, placing the bags in front of her. "Eat." Sophia's sleepy eyes fluttered open at the scent of food, and before Isabella could say anything, the little girl reached forward, grabbing a piece of warm bread. She took a bite and let out a soft sound of pure happiness, as if it was the best thing she had ever tasted. Isabella swallowed, her throat tight. She looked up at the man, her voice breaking. "Why?" He exhaled slowly, then reached up and lowered his hood. And just like that, her world tilted. The dim streetlights illuminated his face, revealing sharp cheekbones, familiar eyes, and a face known across the world. Cristiano Ronaldo. She stared, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't possible. Matteo's mouth fell open, his hands clenching into fists as he struggled to form words. "You're..." Ronaldo smiled, his expression warm but serious. Just someone who was in the right place at the right time. Isabella's heart pounded, her mind racing to make sense of this moment. Why was he here? Why them? As if reading her thoughts, he glanced at Matteo again. "I know what it's like to be hungry," he said softly. "I know what it's like to have nothing." Isabella felt tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Ronaldo replied simply. "Just promise me one thing." She swallowed hard. "Anything." He looked at her, his eyes filled with something deeper than kindness, understanding. "Never stop believing that things can change." Isabella nodded, unable to trust her voice anymore. Ronaldo stood up, glancing down at Matteo, who was still frozen in shock. "And you," he added, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Take care of your family. You're stronger than you know." Matteo's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, then nodded. Ronaldo glanced at them one last time, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night just as quickly as he had appeared. But this time, Isabella knew. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Isabella sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the weight of her entire life had just shifted in a single moment. Cristiano Ronaldo, the Cristiano Ronaldo, stood in front of her, not as the international football icon adored by millions, but as a man who had just given her children food with his own hands. It didn't make sense. Why was he here? Why them? This had to be a dream, one of those cruel tricks the mind plays when hope is nothing more than an illusion. Sophia clutched the warm bread in her tiny hands, nibbling at it slowly, as if afraid it would disappear. Matteo sat stiffly beside her, his face caught somewhere between awe and disbelief, his gaze fixed on Ronaldo as if trying to convince himself that this was real. Isabella's hands trembled as she wrapped the blanket tighter around Sophia's shoulders, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this?" Ronaldo knelt down to her level, his presence both overwhelming and comforting. There was no arrogance in his expression, no trace of pity, just sincerity, a quiet determination that made her throat tighten. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing," he said simply. His words weren't rehearsed or meant for publicity. They were raw, personal, carrying a truth that she hadn't expected. Matteo swallowed hard, his voice breaking the silence. "You were poor?" Ronaldo exhaled, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "I was," he admitted, shifting his weight as he rested his elbows on his knees. "I grew up in a small house with barely enough food to eat. My mother worked harder than anyone I've ever known, just to make sure we survived." He looked at Isabella then, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in a long time, understanding. "And I know what it's like to watch your mother struggle, to wish you could do something, anything to take her pain away." Matteo's grip on the blanket tightened. Isabella could feel his breathing shift, could hear the unspoken emotions caught in his throat. She wanted to say something, but what words could possibly be enough? She had spent so long convincing herself that people like Ronaldo lived in a world too far removed from hers, that they couldn't possibly understand what it meant to be invisible, to be forgotten. And yet, here he was, sitting in the cold with them, proving her wrong. Ronaldo stood up then, brushing the dust from his jeans. "Come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Isabella's heart pounded. "Where?" "To a hotel," he said simply. "You're not sleeping on the streets tonight." She blinked rapidly, shaking her head. No, we can't. You've already done enough." Ronaldo's gaze softened, but there was an undeniable firmness in his voice. "Isabella," he said gently, "no mother should have to wonder where her children will sleep. Let me do this." Her lips trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run, to protect herself from believing in something too good to be true. But then she looked at Sophia, curled up against her chest, her tiny body barely covered by the thin blanket. She looked at Matteo, his shoulders rigid, his eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion no 10-year-old should ever know. And in that moment, she let herself believe. She nodded. Matteo exhaled sharply, his body sagging with relief, but he didn't say anything. Isabella knew why. He was still afraid that if he spoke, it would all disappear. Ronaldo's car was parked just a few feet away, sleek and expensive, standing in stark contrast to the world Isabella and her children had been living in. She hesitated as they approached it, suddenly feeling out of place, unworthy. As if sensing her hesitation, Ronaldo opened the back door and gestured toward Sophia. "Here," he said softly. "She looks exhausted." Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat and carefully slid Sophia into the seat, her tiny body sinking into the plush leather. Matteo climbed in next, stiff but obedient, his hands clutching his sleeves. Isabella followed last, her heart beat erratic as the door shut behind her. The drive was silent, except for the occasional hum of the city passing by. Isabella kept her eyes on the road ahead, her hands twisting in her lap. This felt unreal, like something out of a story. When they arrived at the hotel, Isabella almost couldn't bring herself to step out. She had walked past places like this before, had stared at their golden lights from a distance, wondering what it would feel like to belong inside. And now she was being led through the lobby by Cristiano Ronaldo, past polished floors and elegant chandeliers, past guests who stole glances but didn't dare say anything. The receptionist didn't even blink when Ronaldo requested a suite. Within minutes, they were being escorted upstairs, and when the doors opened, Isabella felt her knees weaken. The room was warm, clean. Soft lighting bathed the space in a golden glow, and for the first time in months, Isabella smelled fresh linens, felt the welcoming embrace of warmth that didn't come from huddling together in the cold. The bed looked impossibly large, covered in thick blankets that promised rest she had long forgotten. Matteo stood frozen, staring at the room as if it were a mirage. Sophia, half asleep in Isabella's arms, stirred slightly, her fingers twitching against the fabric of Isabella's coat. Ronaldo turned to Isabella. "Sleep well," he said simply. "Tomorrow we'll talk." Her throat constricted. "Talk?" He smiled. "This isn't the end." And with that, he was gone. The moment the door clicked shut, Isabella felt the weight of everything crash down on her. She sank to the floor, her shoulders shaking, silent sobs racking her body. Matteo knelt beside her, his small hands gripping hers tightly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick. "We're safe." Safe. The word echoed in her mind, foreign yet comforting. For the first time in forever, she let herself cry. The next morning, Isabella woke up to the soft sound of footsteps. She blinked, adjusting to the unfamiliar ceiling, and for a moment, panic gripped her. Then, she remembered. The hotel, the warmth, the safety. A knock at the door startled her, and when she opened it, she found a well-dressed man standing before her. "Good morning, Miss Isabella," he greeted with a polite nod. "I work for Mr. Ronaldo. He sent me to discuss something important." Her stomach clenched. "What is it?" The man smiled, stepping aside to reveal something she never could have imagined, a set of keys. Her breath hitched. "These belong to you now," the man said. "Cristiano Ronaldo has purchased a house for you and your children." The world tilted. Isabella barely felt herself stumble backward, barely heard Matteo gasp beside her. Everything blurred as her vision swam with tears, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. A house. Her knees gave out before she could stop them, and she collapsed to the floor, the overwhelming kindness too much to contain. The man knelt beside her, placing the keys in her trembling hands. "Welcome home, Ms. Isabella," and for the first time in years she believed it. Sunlight filtered through the white curtains, casting a golden glow across the wooden floors. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the fabric of the warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The room smelled of fresh linen, a scent she had nearly forgotten after so many nights of sleeping on the cold pavement. It had been months since that night, since the moment Cristiano Ronaldo had changed her life with an act of kindness that still felt like a dream. She closed her eyes, taking in the quiet sounds of the morning. From the other room, she could hear Sophia's soft giggles as she played with her dolls, her little feet tapping against the floor. The sound alone was enough to make Isabella's throat tighten with emotion. Sophia no longer shivered in the cold, no longer woke up hungry, no longer clung to Isabella in fear of the dark streets swallowing them whole. And then there was Matteo. She glanced toward the window, her heart swelling as she spotted him outside, a football at his feet, his body moving with an ease she hadn't seen in him for a long time. He was playing again, truly playing, not just surviving. She watched as he kicked the ball toward a small net in the yard, his face lighting up as it sailed perfectly into the goal. "Nice shot," a voice called from the porch. Isabella turned to see Mr. Alvarez, their next-door neighbor, leaning against the railing with a warm smile. He was an older man, kind, always checking in on them ever since they had moved into the house Ronaldo had given them. Matteo grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'm going to be even better than Ronaldo one day," he said, determination shining in his young eyes. Mr. Alvarez chuckled. "You keep practicing like that and I don't doubt it." Isabella smiled, pressing a hand against her chest. This was home now. This was real. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stood, smoothing down her sweater before opening it. A delivery man stood there holding a medium-sized box wrapped in brown paper. "For Isabella Moreira?" he asked. She hesitated. "That's me." He handed her the package with a polite nod before turning to leave. Isabella closed the door behind her, her pulse quickening as she placed the box on the kitchen table. Who could it be from? Carefully, she tore the wrapping away, revealing a neatly sealed white box. The moment she opened it, a soft gasp escaped her lips. Inside lay 3 carefully placed items: a signed football jersey, a beautifully handcrafted doll, and an envelope with her name written in elegant handwriting. Her hands trembled as she picked up the jersey, running her fingers over the signature scrawled across the fabric. It was Ronaldo's, a real official jersey, just for Matteo. She swallowed hard, placing it down before lifting the doll. It was soft, delicate, with blue button eyes and a little pink dress, just the kind of toy Sophia had always longed for but never dared to ask for. And then, the envelope. Her heart pounded as she slid a single card from inside. "Never stop believing in kindness. Your life can change in a moment." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the note against her chest, her body shaking with emotions too vast to contain. This was more than a gift. This was a reminder of hope, of resilience, of the fact that miracles could exist in the most unexpected ways. Sophia's voice broke through the silence. "Mama?" Isabella quickly wiped her tears and turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway, her tiny head tilted in curiosity. "What's that?" Sophia asked, her eyes widening as she spotted the doll. Isabella smiled, holding it out to her. "It's for you, sweetheart." Sophia's eyes sparkled as she carefully took the doll into her small arms, hugging it tightly as if she were afraid it might disappear. "It's so pretty." Matteo walked in next, his brows furrowing as he glanced at the open box. When his eyes landed on the jersey, he froze. "No way," he whispered, reaching out with hesitant fingers. He picked up the jersey, his breath catching as he turned it around to see Ronaldo's signature. His hands shook. "Is this really for me?" Isabella nodded, her heart swelling at the raw emotion in his voice. "Yes, Matteo, it's yours." For the first time in months, he cried. But these weren't the silent, hopeless tears he had shed when they were homeless, when he had tried so hard to be strong for his mother and sister. These were tears of pure, overwhelming happiness. He wiped his face quickly, trying to hide it, but Isabella pulled him into a tight embrace, her own tears spilling over. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to be strong all the time." Matteo sniffled, his grip on the jersey tightening. I never thought something like this could happen to us." Isabella ran a hand through his hair. "Neither did I." The weight of everything, the pain they had endured, the suffering they had pushed through, felt distant now, like a memory that no longer had power over them. They had survived, and not only that, they had been given a new chance at life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Isabella stood by the window, watching as Matteo practiced outside, his movements lighter, freer. He was no longer just a boy weighed down by hardship. He was a dreamer again. Sophia sat on the porch beside her, cradling her doll, humming softly to herself. The sound was peaceful, soothing. Isabella exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. She thought back to the nights she had spent on the streets, to the prayers she had whispered into the darkness, begging for a miracle. And a miracle had come. Not in the form of money or luck or something intangible. It had come in the form of a man who had once been a poor child himself, a man who knew what it meant to suffer and chose to give instead of forget. She looked down at the note still clutched in her hand. "Never stop believing in kindness. Your life can change in a moment." Her lips trembled as she smiled. Ronaldo had changed their lives, yes, but he had also done something even greater. He had given them the courage to believe again. And with that, Isabella knew, deep in her heart, that their story wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope. And hope was the most powerful thing of all. As Isabella stood in the warmth of her new home, watching her children finally sleep without fear, she knew their story wasn't just about survival. It was about the power of kindness. A single act had rewritten their future, proving that in a world where so many turn away, there are still those who choose to make a difference. This story isn't just about Ronaldo's generosity. It's a reminder that no matter who we are, we all have the ability to change someone's life. It doesn't always take wealth or fame. Sometimes it's a small gesture, a moment of compassion, a decision to help when no one else does. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with others. Let it serve as a reminder that kindness is not just an idea, it's an action. And in a world that often feels divided, these actions are what truly matter. Tell us, have you ever experienced a moment of unexpected kindness? A time when someone's generosity changed your life in ways you never expected? Your story might be the inspiration someone else needs today. Every small act counts. Every decision to help, to uplift, to believe in something better. It all matters. Because in the end, what we do for others is what truly defines us.